Hi guys. I need you to let me know if this is loud enough. Is this loud enough, do you think?
Unless you want to just wait there.
Do you hear? Okay, thank you. All right, well great. Thank you all for coming. Good evening and welcome to Prairie Lights. I'm Kathleen Johnson, the events coordinator at Prairie Lights, and tonight I am pleased to present Writers Workshop graduate Ada Zhang, who will read from her short story collection, The Sorrows of Others, published by A Public Space. She will be joined in conversation by Jamel Brinkley. The Sorrows of Others has received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly, Booklist, and Forward. It was called Sharp and Revelatory by the New York Times, and author Jess Walter says, I loved The Sorrows of Others, a luminous, moving collection of stories about love and family and belonging. Ada Zhang writes across generations with a rare sense of grace and precision. Ada Zhang is a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. Her short stories have appeared in A Public Space, McSweeney's, American Short Fiction, and elsewhere. She's currently the James C. McCreight Fiction Fellow at the University of Wisconsin. She will read a section from the book and then be joined in conversation by Jamel Brinkley, who's the author of A Lucky Man and Witness, and he teaches fiction writing at the Writers Workshop. And we'll take time after that conversation for audience questions. It is now my pleasure to welcome Ada Zhang.
Hi everyone. Thank you for being here. It feels very surreal to be on this side of the lectern. Yeah, and thank you to Prairie Lights for hosting me. I spent a lot of time here while I was in grad school, so this feels really, really special. I'm going to read a whole story, a complete story, and it's the shortest story in my collection, so I think you will see how short it is. It's titled One Day. One day. On a random weekday in November, when I was a child and not yet weary of his kindness, my father drove 40 minutes from his workplace to have lunch with me in the school cafeteria. Handprint turkeys lined the halls of the school's first floor, from the entrance up to the library, then splitting in two directions down the various homerooms of K through 3rd. Each little turkey was cut from a paper plate, each colored brown in the palm, the turkey's chest, with a flash of red below the beak, the part we called the turkey's gobble. In the center, we'd written our names: Eric, James, Annabelle. Helen, my father read out loud when he found mine. He touched the fingers, which I decorated in orange and brown feathers and nothing else. The other turkeys were more exciting. Feathers in pink and blue and purple, plus glitter and sequins, pom-poms with bits of tinsel. But mine was the most realistic, I thought. During the craft, it had bothered me that no one else seemed to care about this. Use your imagination, Helen, Miss Evans had said. But my imagination, I wanted to tell her, had rules. Even in kindergarten, it seemed plain to me that certain things were not possible. It's super, my father said, looking down at me. He smiled and touched the back of my head. Are you hungry? In the cafeteria, I scanned the mayhem, all those bodies in one fluorescent gray room, until I caught Miss Evans, her stubby fingers spread wide and waving at me, as though her explosion of hair or outfit wouldn't have given her away. I didn't have friends. Miss Evans was always making efforts to include me, fold me in with the other kids, but I took my cues from adults, the other teachers, and I maintained a separation between me and her. The cafeteria smelled, as it always did, of something fried and something sour. My classmates with packed lunches were already seated with their sandwiches, their baggies of grapes and baby carrots. Everyone else was in line, where I would have been too, sliding a tray of pizza with a side of mashed potatoes, if on that day my father had not come and surprised me. At the far end of the table where no one was sitting yet except for us, he removed 2 clear containers from his lunchbox, both pocked with moisture on the inside. He looked around, then raised his hand in the air as though he were one of us, a student. He winked at me, sitting across from him, and I tried to wink back. Miss Evans was down one table, monitoring a different homeroom. She saw my father and made like she was running. Her pants swished, her enormous arms rolled from side to side. "Yes, Mr. Chen," she said, out of breath. "Is there a microwave somewhere so I can heat up our food?" "Sure, if you come with me, I can take you to the teacher's lounge right down the..." Just as she finished the last word, Miss Evans threw her head back and sneezed, sending one of her silver hoop earrings slicing through the air to the ground near our feet. The noise was so loud, the convulsion of her body so huge and terrifying that I ducked and covered my face. My father tapped my knee 3 times before I moved my elbows away before Miss Evans could notice. "Bless you," he said, and reached under the table. When he resurfaced a moment later, Miss Evans was blinking rapidly with wide open eyes like she'd just appeared someplace new. She sniffed, and instead of taking the earring my father had retrieved, she cocked her head sideways to remove the other hoop from her other ear. "These things never stay in," she said. She spoke as though forced into admission. "They're cheap." "They look nice on you," said my father. After a pause, he added, "Cheers," lifting the earring to my kindergarten teacher, the hoop held solidly, daintily between his thumb and index finger, and the signature for "okay." Miss Evans gasped. She let the breath go in a soft, choppy laugh, exposing something fragile, and I got the sense that for Miss Evans, life had turned one way, the wrong way, a long time ago, and now could not find its way back. "Cheers," she said. They clinked hoops, making a dull, disappointing sound. We ate noisily and with our heads down, chopsticks flicking the way we ate at home. By then the lines had cleared and the tables were full. The boy sitting next to us stared, and I thought nothing of it. My world was still too small for me to feel ashamed. "What you did earlier, Helen," my father began once we were finished, "it wasn't nice." He stacked the empty containers on top of each other and pushed them aside. "You could have hurt your teacher's feelings." I said, "I know." My father began peeling an orange and carved the fruit out in seconds in one tremendous sweep of his thumb. He broke it in half and gave one to me. I wonder if he suspected then that I was beginning to detect weakness and to feel repulsed by it. "Helen is such a sweet girl," my father was always telling everyone. Over the years, it became clear to me that he'd interpreted my reclusiveness for loneliness, my brooding for sophistication, when actually I was, as a child, already sick of the world and hardening myself to it, so it could never do to me what it had done to Miss Evans, what it had done to my father, who raised me on his own. I thought he was too good for the feckless types on whom his charms were most effective, until eventually I viewed him as one of them, someone who did not know how to make life easier. I left home when I was 18 and remained distant until he got sick. When I returned, I watched a man turn into a gnarled, hollowed body, as though someone had taken a spoon to his skin and scooped out the flesh, and I knew, before being told, that something so small and destroyed could not survive. I've learned to be softer now, but there remains a frayed thread of that part of me from before. At times I feel it writhing, in my intolerance for slowness, my impatience, even though now I'm someone's partner and a mother to 2 children. I was 25 when he died. "Don't go," I said to him when lunch was over. We were standing near the school's entrance. All around us, kindergartners were filing out of the cafeteria. First graders were making their way in, a scene repeating itself. "Baba has to go back to work. I'll see you in a few hours at home." "But I don't want to be here," I said. The idea of resuming an ordinary day filled me with dread. "I want you to be with me." My father knelt down. He aligned my hand to his in a still high five and said, "Look, my turkey's so much bigger than yours." When I said nothing, he draped my arms over his shoulders. "You'll make friends, I promise you," he said. "It gets better." He kissed me firmly on the forehead, and I watched him leave. There was a spring in his step, the gait of someone strong and healthy. Miss Evans came and stood with me by the glass doors, and to my surprise, she did not turn me away. It wouldn't occur to me until I was an adult that probably no one had ever raised a toast to Miss Evans before, that my father was likely the first, perhaps the only. Before that, I couldn't appreciate the perfect strangeness of their encounter. Together we watched him get into his car and drive. I stared out even after he was gone until I felt ready. Then Miss Evans walked me back to class. Thank you. Thank you, Jamel, for being in conversation with me.
My pleasure. Okay, I think this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm glad you read that story, because I think it gives me a couple of jumping off points to start our conversation. So this is one of the stories, one of the first person stories in the collection that has a really powerful use of retrospection. And I kind of wanted to ask you about that. I wanted to ask you about that, like mobilizing retrospection in the story, the way you think about what retrospection does in your stories, the kinds of things that it can do, the way it shapes or drives your stories. So maybe we can just start there.
Yeah. Well, I think like whenever you're talking about retrospection or thinking about it, you're really talking about time. And I think that actually the challenge with retrospection is that it can be too powerful. And this story that I read, is the retrospection is probably the strongest, just because it just really focuses on one moment, really. I mean, the title of the story is One Day, and it's just like the action is pretty simple, but it's the retrospection that gives it some heft. So I don't know, I think like, there are a few stories that are told in the first person retrospective, and I think that just like having the narrator, having some distance like between the narrator and the character, who are the same person but are one is telling the story and one is an actor in the story. And I think it's a lot of fun to try and find the right kind of way to balance those two. So yeah, and I think in in some stories I started with a retrospective narrator that was like much too strong, and then in some of the stories I really like in the last story in the collection, it was actually first titled Compromise. It was at first in workshop when I turned it in, it was written in the third person. This was in Charles D'Ambrosio's workshop, and he was like, we're not close enough to the character. Like, we need to be able to see what is happening. Like, there's a sick man in that story, and he was very like, why aren't we seeing the body? And so I had to change that to a first person, so that I could get closer and so that I could see. And then something that Margot talks about that I think was really helpful to me in thinking about why the first person retrospective is so powerful. Why, if you have like a first person and that first person has a lot of time distance, there's a lot of time that has passed between the telling of the story and the story occurring. I think it's because Margot calls it shuttling. You can kind of there's a freedom that comes with a powerful retrospective narrator. It's a freedom that's, I don't know, almost like omniscience, but it's, you can direct the reader to look at different points in time. So it's I don't know, it's one of those like with great power comes great responsibility things, and it's hard to control. But I think I came into the workshop thinking I'm a third person writer, which it's like nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. But I found the retrospective to be incredibly fun because you just get to play with time a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to stick with this story for a second more, because one of the other things that it's doing is sort of participating in a long and rich history of literary homage.
Yeah.
In this case, Edward P. Jones.
Yeah.
And so I kind of want to ask you about that. I want to ask you about, because a few of the stories in the collection are doing this. And I want to ask you about homage as a way to start a story, the idea of a story talking to a story. Yeah, so if you just, any thoughts or you have about that?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm gonna invoke the great Margot Livesey again, but she's someone, a teacher that I had that really encouraged us all to participate in this tradition of the homage, and she would, and I think it's just, I think whenever you're writing, you're never writing in a vacuum. You're writing into a tradition, big or small. And every writer finds their way into their literary heritage, and I think it's really exciting to find the writers that you love, and to be writing, be writing in conversation with them, So this story, One Day, is definitely an homage to Edward P. Jones's first day, The First Day, which is one of my favorite short stories. And I was just so impressed with how, he's like a master, so I was just kind of amazed by how much of an entire life we got in that story, and that story is also really short. It might be even shorter than the story that I read. So I was just like, wow, how did he write such a tiny story, but with it's just so powerful. And so I think I was like, I challenge, and the retrospective is actually has a lighter touch. He does it better than me. The retrospective is only in one line in the first sentence, and that's it. And I think it's before I learned to be ashamed of my mother, and that's it. And then the whole, but that little clause, it just gives a scale of time to the story, and that gives it a lot of, it just injects it with, it just transforms it from an anecdote, I think, into a story. And so certainly I think I was reading him, and I was reading a lot of his mentor, James Allen McPherson, who was a teacher at Iowa, and who's an incredible writer. And I was reading, some great short story writers. I was reading Eudora Welty, which kind of opened me up to thinking about writing about the South, and I just think that and something Yun Lee I think says about the homage, it's a tradition she loves to participate in. She has many stories that are homages to William Trevor or to Chekhov, and it's a practice she very much encourages. And the thing that she always says, correct me if I'm wrong if she doesn't say this, but is that the story that you write will always take on a life of its own. At one point, the story is going to assert its will on you, on the story, and it's going to depart from the piece that it was inspired by. So, and it's happened every time. Every time I'm like, oh, I'm great. I'm just going to rip off Edward P. Jones. That never happens because the story decides that it wants to do what it wants to do. So I don't know. I think it's just a really thrilling way to learn about writing, and to interact with writing that has moved you. Yeah.
Cool. So let's kind of zoom out to consider some of the other stories in the collection. I want to ask you, what are some other ways that stories begin for you? So, other than homage, other than sort of talking back to another story, what are the kinds of things that spark your imagination? What are some clues that tell you this seed or whatever could be the start of an actual story that you're going to write?
Starting a story. It's usually like I have like a vibe. Yeah. And it's really as loose as that. It's like sometimes it's as small as like an atmosphere or something. It's like something in the air, and you try to capture that strangeness, or I think there are feelings I've had walking into a room that I've never had again, and I think like something, when you just kind of feel like the energy in here is weird, or like I don't know, just something kind of ineffable. And I think often I start there, but I think what that is actually is setting. I've learned over time. I think it's where the story is set. And so my first draft problem I often had, like all my first drafts that I turned in workshop, and like my friends who are in workshop with me, like I'm embarrassed that they will remember this, and like my teachers will remember this, but I would submit a story and it would be like, a woman is getting ready for bed, and then she lays down for bed, and then she thinks about her entire life. And then that was the whole story, and I was like, yeah, she's just going to bed thinking about her life, like that's, and then like it was always like, oh well, something needs to happen, like she can't just like lie there and think about her life, and then that's the entire story. So I had to like, I think like setting was probably one of my weaker, like it was something I just didn't think about very much when I, used to start a story, and now it's like the thing I think about first, because I just know how fecund it is for everything, for mood, atmosphere, like tone. It can like drive the sentence. It can make your sentences sound different if you're thinking about where the character is and what's around them, the people that are around them, the quality of the air, I think all of it is, it's world building. So now I try to actually, do that first instead of figuring out the character's entire life. And it's definitely like setting is the thing that has made my stories more active. And whenever I get stuck, I try to look around, like what's around the character. Can they pick something up? Can they throw something? Like, so just like recommitting to wherever they are, and drawing from their setting to I don't know, to move this story forward. I mean, I thought a lot about setting, and like why is it that it's so why is it such a rich place to draw, tool to draw from? And I think it's that setting is just like naturally an adversary to your characters. I think setting, it contains them, and it naturally gives your story limitations, like where's your character gonna go, it confines your character, and then so it naturally, you're kind of set up to kind of have to define your character within those confines. And so I don't know, I think it's always leaning into the problems of the story, and writing your way through the issues and weaknesses in your own writing, that you kind of discover what kind of writer you are and what kind of stories you want to write.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I noticed when I was rereading the collection in preparation for this is how elegantly sequenced the collection is. And how the stories in the collection feel like they're really, sort of talking to each other. So it's not just a forward progression as you're reading from the beginning to the end, but also you'll get to story 5 or 6, and it'll sort of call back to something earlier. So I kind of want to ask you about that process. It's sort of a classic short story collection question, but And Margot and I taught a class on short story collections last semester, so I'm thinking about this. But in the case of this book, either your own work individually on the stories, working with your editors, what kinds of things, went into the process of figuring out, which stories were going to be in the book and how they were going to be sequenced, and other kinds of things that may have just sort of, tied the stories together into something that is unified.
Yeah. No, I love this question because because putting the collection together was one of like I was like, I finally reached the fun part, of all of this, because I thought it was tremendously fun, because now the stories kind of, I worked on them on each his own terms, and then to put them together was incredibly thrilling. Yeah, I don't know. It was tough. Like for the last collection, me and my editor, we felt like it could have been the first or the last, and so. We ended up putting it as the last, and that feels right to me now. And I think it would be a really different opening if it were first. I talked about this to some of the students in Christabel's class. I see them here, but I put the story, the subject that's first in the collection. I put it first because it's probably the most. It might be the story that grapples with the most intellectual kind of questions about art and authenticity and who gets to tell what stories and so these are God, on Twitter these questions come up freaking every other day, but I felt like there has to be a way that I can write into that discourse without writing a tweet about it. I really, it's something that Charlie has said, give your questions to your characters. And so, I personally had a lot of, my parents are immigrants, but I'm not an immigrant, and a lot of the stories are told from immigrants' point of view. So and I had to ask myself, well, what right do I have to tell, these stories? And so writing the subject was my way of figuring that out, and I think that's why I ended up, me and Bridget Hughes, my editor, we decided to put that one first, because I just wanted to up the ante for everyone's reading experience, that, if just to know that, these let's not pretend these questions aren't here. They can be with you while you're reading the book, and I don't know. I just think I think it's starting to change, but there are terms like immigrant literature and stuff are still marketing terms in the industry, and I knew that it was very possible that my book would. Yeah, of course, it's entering the big publishing machine. So, people are allowed to say what they want about it after it comes out. They can say it's a book about the Asian American experience. They can say it's a book about immigrants. They can say whatever they want. And I was fine with that. But I did want to hold everybody to a bit of a higher standard, just to make the reading a little bit more sophisticated of the stories that follow, because I thought they deserved that. So that's why I put that one first. So that one was the one that I felt the most strongly about, that it should come first. And then my editor was so lovely. She was honestly, I think any order it might work. and so what it ended up being about for me was trying to vary up the, if there was a male point of view character, then and there are only two, but so I tried to insert them within the other female points of view, so that there'd be some variation there. There are stories told from very young characters' point of view, and then there are stories that are told from very old people's point of view, and I tried to go back and forth with those as well, just to create a reading experience that felt like with every story you were getting something a little bit different. I'm glad that it felt graceful to you. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's stick with the idea of editing the collection. This may be useful for some of the folks who are here, but I'm just thinking about, maybe you can talk about one or two of the stories in the collection as it was going through the process of being revised and edited. You can talk about how a story changed, or how a story evolved, or how a problem you were trying to figure out was solved in the process of preparing the book for publication.
Yeah, well, since I'm here back home at Iowa, I might take it even further and talk about like from when it was first shown to my classmates' eyes, and how a story changed from there. The title story, The Sorrows of Others, I workshop in Lan Samantha Ching's class, and before that workshop went up, I was distraught. It was one of those workshops where I just felt like my work is really weak, and everyone's gonna see it, and everyone's gonna see my frailties, and I remember saying to Sam was like, well, how do you know that? Like, how do you know that it's not, that it doesn't have anything, worthwhile in it? And I was like, and I said to Sam, I am a really good judge of my own work. And I think she was like, oh, whoa, like she was like, Sam, and like, oh, whoa. And then I might have forgotten this, to be honest, that I said this, but then when the story with McSweeney's picked it up for publication, and I told Sam, and Sam was like, remember when you said you're a really accurate judge of your own work? But the story had changed a lot, obviously, from when I submitted it to when it was it was published in McSweeney's and then later in the book. But that's all to say, I don't think we are good judges of our own work, and that story in particular, I remember distinctly, truly believing it was not good, and that I felt really like I felt a lot of conviction on that, and I was really like, okay, this is just going to be one of those like throwaway workshops where I waste everyone's time. But then actually, when I look back on that story, the beginning and ending are actually like the exact same. They didn't change really at all. But there's a whole middle section that got added. It was basically almost like it was at first like a 2-part story, and then it became like a story in 3 acts. And that was in the editing process, and it was even, that was once I started like working on the book in earnest, that kind of happened. Another one of the big and painful revisions that I had to do was on the last story, Compromise, when Charlie told me, that we can't see the main conflict that was going on, and that we had to get closer. I was like, oh no, I think I have to totally change the point of view, which means I have to rewrite the whole story, which is what I did. So that was probably one of the most radical changes that I made. But I think it was really, it taught me that you sometimes have to do that, which is upsetting, but necessary. And with Bridget is such a great editor, my editor. She's just so smart, and she would always just ask me questions. And sometimes she would say, like, you don't even need to answer this. It doesn't need to be answered in the story, but I just am curious.
What kinds of questions?
Okay, so like in this story, like Sister Machinery, there are these parents who've like lost a child, and she asked me, how did they meet? And I was, and it was interesting because I immediately had to answer. I was like, oh, they were high school sweethearts, because I had already imagined these characters' lives that far. But yeah, she like would deeply inhabit my stories to the point where she would want to know these things, like what did they do in high school, where were they when they were younger, and she would just kind of want to know, and it was always like these little details, and what it did was just help me, inhabit my story deeper. And then one of the most helpful things she said to me was the quote from, she said it's something she heard Danielle Evans say at a talk, that every short story should have 2 endings. One that's resolved by the end of the story, and another that keeps you up at night. And that was very interesting to me. And that helped me think about a lot of this, and that helped me, yeah, I don't know. So it was very, I would sometimes be like, what do you want me to do? Just tell me what to do. But she never told me what to do. She always just would ask me questions that helped me figure out what the story wanted to do. So, but revision, I mean, I think I revised these stories like from the time that they were required to publication, like two and a half years almost passed. So I was revising for a long time, and the stories did change in some insubstantial ways, like the ways that I mentioned, like a whole middle section was added in the story, knowing like 3 new scenes, appeared. So definitely, like, I felt like at that level, I mean, it was, just thrilling to have an editor who's so smart and so devoted and loves literature so much. To have them work on your stories with you is really a great gift.
So I have a question. It's going to sound like a superficial question, but I don't think it is. I kind of want to ask you, do you have a favorite character from the book? Or do you have a character that you still think about or even puzzle over? Something like that, because I'm just trying to get to basically how you think about your characters.
Yeah.
In other words, but just by focusing on maybe one of them that you either have a lot of affection for, that maybe your relationship to the character changed over the course of working on a particular story, a character maybe you still think about from time to time, or a character who's kind of a puzzle to you.
I'm looking at them.
Yeah, take your time.
I do have to say that Granny Tan is special to me. She's in the first story, The Subject, and she is just wild. And she said stuff that I thought would get me canceled. So,
You want to tell them about her a little bit?
Sure.
You're not going to get canceled.
Okay, right. Yeah, right. This is, yes. So she's just, she's, again, I was really thinking about, like, okay, what right do I have to, I mean, I think it's an unfair burden that writers who are minorities have to think about, is like, oh God, and it's getting better because there are more of us now that are writing and publishing but yeah, I did feel that, like, gosh, like this unfair burden that this book would be about the Asian American experience, all capital letters, and I just felt like I can't represent, like
the burden of representation.
Yeah, the burden of representation. I just can't. I am one person, and so I really was like, I wanted to show someone who had a different a totally different immigrant experience than the one that I had and the one that my parents had, and it's sort of one that I do think gets short shrift in literature, like the underbelly of the immigrant experience, which is not all upward mobility, Yeah. So sometimes it's downward mobility, and so Granny Tan kind of appeared in my grappling with all of this, and she just, she's the most, forceful character that I've ever encountered, who just really asserted her will in a really, really strong way into the story, and I had no control over her, and I think she's actually a lot of fun. I think she's actually, really funny, and yeah, and I do think about her, and I think it's partly because in the story, I think one of the the thing that haunts the narrator is that she never hears from Granny Tan again. Like, Granny Tan kind of disappears out of her life, out of her own doing, but still. And I feel like that is kind of how I feel about her too. I'm like, she's somewhere, hope she's okay. You know, yeah.
So I think we might be ready for audience Q&A.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you. Oh, we've got a question over here.
I just had a question about how you heighten emotion in your stories, because there was a point in the short story where you were reading, and it was when the dad was leaving, like in the retrospective part. But before that, in the future part, you described, like the narrator was describing that he died, and that made me a lot more emotional. And I wanted to ask, like, how do you heighten the emotional impact that the reader feels?
Wow. I don't think when I'm writing that I'm trying to create a big emotional impact. No, but I suppose that I am trying to create that for myself. I don't know. I think those moments they don't come to me in the first draft. Certainly, I don't think I'm emotionally compelling to anyone in my first drafts. But then I think like later I think it's just about knowing your characters very intensely and knowing their inner lives and knowing details about them that don't make it onto the page. I think that's what makes it feel like they're really alive, you know, that they've really lived, is that you know so much about them, and I really think it's that creates that emotional impact. It's that there's this real life there. You know, I think like that's what great fiction does. It's like, you know, it feels real. It feels like it's real, and I think by knowing your characters really well, you can achieve that. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for reading and being here.
Yeah.
Been a fan of your work since I read Compromise in a Public Space.
Oh, wow, thank you.
But the question I have, you talked a bit about beginnings, and also you mentioned the bit, I think you said, Daniel Evans said about endings, but I'm curious, especially with the conversation about, you know, first-person retrospective and how it offers a kind of malleable shape to stories, and also just like your indebtedness to Edward P. Jones. And I find like his story shapes to be like kind of really surprising, and his endings are also like strange and like mysterious, and also just like utterly delightful and feel like absolutely right. And so I'm curious, you said of one of your stories that like in workshop, the beginning and ending didn't change, and I'm just curious, like, how do you think about endings, or like how do you, like, when do you feel like you've arrived at an ending? And also like if for other stories did like an ending change, and if so, like what did that open up for the story? Yeah, and in particular I'm also just thinking about like Compromise too. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That was a mouthful.
No, I know you guys are learning about endings. No, endings are hard, and I had this teacher who kind of started me on this difficult path, Arna Bontemps Hemingway, who was Sam's student, and he was my teacher in college, and he was incredibly honest with me about my work, which it's a miracle I'm still writing, actually. He was so honest. I mean, like, so like with the endings, like he would write V bad. just V bad. He sometimes would also write V good, you know, but never on my endings. Every ending I wrote was V bad, and so I started to like really seriously like think about my endings like so hard. I was like always thinking about endings, and often they were the first things I thought about was like I don't know, something to write towards, and And sometimes it is like that. Sometimes I actually have an image or something and I am writing toward it. So I kind of operate from the ending. The ending is actually like kind of the way I enter the story. But then other times, no way. Like the ending for the story Julia changed a million times. But I do think that because I got V-bad so many times on like my endings that I started to just like pay particular attention to them. And again, I really think writing towards that weakness, like trying to address it, trying to write through it can be really helpful. For compromise, the ending of course changed because the whole point of view changed. So I had this new ending, but you know, it was really interesting when I was working on that story. I mean, I really had to sit down with myself when I was like, am I really gonna rewrite this whole story from a different point of view? But I had to, because Charlie called it grabby. So I was like, I think I have to at least give this like one more chance if Charlie thinks it's grabby, which I don't even know what that means, but it seemed exciting. And so actually though, when I finally was like, okay, I got over myself. I was like, okay, you're gonna do this. I remember it was Thanksgiving break. I was like, you're gonna use your Thanksgiving break to just totally rewrite this story. And I did. And I actually sat from beginning to end and kind of wrote it from beginning to end. And it actually kind of came out contained in that way. But it was because I had already done so much of the other work in that other draft, in that when I was writing in the third person, that once I changed it to the first person, actually it really unlocked something. And it was really, I mean, I was trying to tell the same story, but it was actually, the telling of it was more interesting, and the action, well, you actually saw a body there, which was the thing that the first draft was missing. So I don't know, endings are tough. I think the thing that I always say about them, I said this in an article that's published, I think that, you know, they should feel big enough that they can contain all the parts of the story that come before, but they should also be small enough that they can pass as just another detail. I think like you don't want the ending to announce itself as the ending. It's just a part of the story, the way that every other part of the story is a part of the story. Yeah.
My question is about, you mentioned earlier that you previously sort of thought of yourself as like a third-person writer, and even though you were saying that you were trying to get away from that, but what thought processes sort of got you to feeling that way? Was it about your writing style? Was it about sort of the way that the different sort of like first person, second person, third person writing is like perceived? What was sort of the way that you got to the idea of being a third person writer, and how do you then get out of that like idea?
Yes, thank God I got out of that, because it doesn't make any sense to align yourself with one point of view. No, it was just like, I was like, well, all the great writers I know write in the third person, so that must be the superior point of view. You know, I was like, if Tolstoy is writing in like the third person, then it must be, you know, the way. I think I hadn't read like a ton of Philip Roth yet. You know, there's lots of wonderful fiction literature that's written in the first person, but in sincerity, I was attracted to the distance that the third person gives you. I thought it could give a writer more control. And it is true that sometimes with when I first started playing around with the first person, I think the story that I really tried to you know, when I really was like, all right, I'm gonna write in the first person, it was Sister Machinery, which I was thinking about reading tonight. And I just felt totally out of control in the first draft, because I just felt like it was too powerful. It could really go anywhere suddenly in a first person. Sometimes a voice will emerge, and it's like, what is this voice, and why are they so loud, and why are they controlling the rhythm of my sentences? And so a first person, you know, comes with all of that, and it is really, really thrilling. And I think I just like eventually was like, you know what, it feels chaotic to write in this point of view, but it also gives you so much freedom, and it's fun. And I still also love, there's something also really similarly difficult about the third person. The third person, if you're in the third person omniscient, I have, you know, I keep saying when I'm 40, I'm gonna write in the omniscient point of view because I'll be mature.
40.
40. That was Sam laughing. Sam, who just published an omniscient narrated novel. I don't know, it's really, really tough to do. So I don't think I have a handle on any of the points of view. They're schooling you all the time on how to write. And I think I arrived at the conclusion that no, I'm not just an exclusively third-person writer because that's really stupid. You know, I think what's exciting about writing is play and learning and trying new things. And yeah, I did have this view that the third person was the most literary, but I've loved playing in the first person and have never written a second-person story, but maybe one day.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. I had a question. You maybe kind of low-key addressed it earlier, but I had a question about earlier you mentioned that you like write towards the ending, and I'm like curious. My question was more of a craft question about how you deal with writing the middle of a story and stringing together the beginning and getting towards that ending, because I know this might be a personal thing, but I hate writing middles of anything. That's where everything just like the wheels come off and everything's just like going to hell. So I just am curious how your strategies and how you work towards getting through the middle of something.
Middles are really hard. I just said endings are hard, but middles are also hard. Beginnings can also be hard. But the middle, I think the middle starts to become a little more clear for me during revision. Or like what needs to happen actually. Again, like my first draft, someone lying down thinking about their life, and then when I revise, I try to get in there and actually I think when you're working on a middle, I think it's best to just let the story be as messy as possible. You can almost like overstuff it. Definitely during drafting, I would say that that's best because then you give yourself a lot of material to work with when you go back and revise. Which is why a first draft, like someone just going to bed and lying down thinking about their life, is actually not a great. I mean, it's fine. It's fine. It was my first draft problem, but I think I have found that it's easier to excise stuff. So go really big and messy in the first draft, and make really weird decisions. If you're stuck, just make a decision. Like the great thing about drafting is like this isn't going to be up for the Pulitzer Prize, so it's okay if it's doesn't make sense or is really crazy, as long as you can, I think, get through the middle and get to that end and have a complete thing that you can work with. That's very flawed, but that then you can kind of break down, reassemble. I think that's good. So I would say with middles, just lean into the chaos. Lean into like possibilities. Literally, just again recommit yourself to the setting. Sometimes in the middle of my stories, I would just be like, "What does my character look like?" And then I would just like kind of like be like, "Well, they dyed their hair now." Like I would just like literally do something small like that, just to like get something moving. I think literally one of my characters dyes their hair, so you will see that was probably a remnant from me just trying to like get something to change, get something to move. It's really important to just like resuscitate.
Hello.
Hi.
Sorry, I don't talk in front of a bunch of people very often.
Me
so I'm
neither.
Sorry, but I guess just my question is like, I guess it's a bit of a cliche one, but it's like, how do you stay motivated when you've received criticism? So how you said like with endings, like your teacher would sometimes look very bad because it's like, I'm being trained to be a writer, and sometimes I'll get criticisms like that, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's horrible. It's like, I can't continue. So I'm just curious about like how you would stay motivated to continue? Like, I'm glad that you made your book and everything, so I'm
Thank
just
you.
curious about that.
That is a really good question. How do I stay motivated? I actually think it's not really about staying motivated. To me, it's more about at a certain. I remember when I felt like I had to stay motivated, like I had to tell myself stay motivated, and during this was when I was living in New York in my early 20s, and I was really my biggest fear was that I had just gotten out of school, away from this mean teacher. I love this teacher. He's very dear to me. But I was wondering if I would continue writing. I was like, will I write on my own? No one's watching me. There's no structure. There's no school. I was just working a full-time job. And I remember during that time I was stay motivated. I would self-talk to myself you're gonna go to the coffee shop this weekend, right? And you're just gonna sit there. But then over time, definitely by the time I came to Iowa, and certainly by the time I left, eventually it just becomes a practice. It really does become a habit, and it just, I no longer have that fear that I will stop writing, even though I know it's I might not, even if I never publish anything ever again, I don't think anymore that I'm not gonna write, because at this point it's part of who I am, and it's, but I do think before you get there, you have to kind of train yourself to I guess just it's about staying motivated, in the end, for yourself, just knowing that it's meaningful to carve out this time in your day to do this, even if you get VBAD on your work or whatever. And yeah, I think it's for me, it's just over time you start to develop a confidence that writing does belong in your life. It's important that it's part of your life, and so it becomes less of I need to be motivated, say to go on a run or something, this extracurricular thing that I'm motivating myself to do, and it's more just no, I need this to be able to get through my day. So, but I think I don't know, and I think that takes a lot to get there, and in the meantime, while you're getting there, support from friends and valued readers, and honestly, reading. I think it was Zadie Smith who said one time reading is original sin. Reading is original love. And then writing is kind of what happens because you love reading so much, then you want to participate in the tradition of literature. But writing keeps me incredibly motivated. It makes me want to write. It makes me want to engage with myself. It makes me interested in myself and in other people. So yeah, I think always reading good books, and yeah, but also just believing in yourself that this is it's meaningful to write. It is.
Okay, and 3 people had their hands up, so we'll just do.
Okay,
these last
rapid.
3.
Great.
Sometimes you were talking about you didn't think the stories sometimes in the beginning were good enough. Isn't that because the flow of writing isn't coming the way you want it to? And it's not like in a capitalist society where there's competition and pressure, you better produce or you don't. Writing is an entirely different perspective, so that the problems one might have, I think, is the coalescence of ideas and incidents in the story aren't working. And I think that there's the creative juices aren't flowing, but I think there's something called momentum. It happens with athletes too. You get in the zone and you can't stop writing. You can't, and then there are other times you stare at the blank page and it's just nothing. You don't know what to do. And I think you see this in Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. They began a lot of projects that they never finished, and people said, what's wrong with them? They're very talented. And then another moment, you're in a zone where Michelangelo can finish the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but it's bumpy. you know, some days you go into work, there's nothing. Other days you go into work and it just keeps flowing and you don't know why. So you get what athletes call a zone, where you're playing the best tennis you could ever do, you're playing the best basketball like Michael Jordan, and you just can't you can't explain it when you're in the zone and when you're not.
Yes. That's correct. Agree with everything.
Hi, thank you again for the reading. I want to return a bit to what you were saying about character, and you mentioned how Granny Tan came from almost this kind of intellectual origin of like trying to work against some stereotypes. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more on like giving her then more life, and how other characters that you might take bits from real life and making them kind of your own in fiction, and the process of like building character that way.
Yeah. My characters, you know what it is I like about Granny Tan actually, is that she has a lot of attitude. And yeah, that's something I remember Margot would say, like she would be like, give your characters attitude, give them an attitude. And just imagine like a tiny Scottish lady saying that, give your characters attitude. But it was like, it's true. You know, I think like that was really helpful for me, because it's attitude. What is that? I don't know, but when someone has attitude, you sense it. Like when they walk into the room and they have an attitude, like it's there sometimes. You know, they don't even have to say anything, and just they have attitude. And it sort of is something that I think, like, you know, all of my characters, I think they take up a lot of space, like. In the stories, like they definitely are formidable. They're pretty strong in what they want, or in what they really don't want. And so I think you know, I think like, I don't know, I guess like people, you know, when they talk about stories and trying to create one, like conflict comes up. Like people are like, oh, give your story a conflict or something, which yes. All my stories, certainly there is something at stake, I suppose, but I think honestly just literally thinking about what my characters look like really helps me develop who they are. Like, what do they look like? So Granny Tan, there's like a passage where it's basically a character sketch. It talks about her hair, what she wears pink Adidas slides. You know, I think like her hairs are like the whiskers on a roused cat. I'm just recalling from memory right now, but these things are really helpful. Like you know, so I try to think about what my characters look like all the time, and that's why I think like in one story I like to try and just get something moving. I literally made one of my young characters change her hair color. I don't know, because I think you know, while I am very interested in my characters' inner lives, I am also interested in what they do. But it was a weakness of mine. It was pretty embarrassing when Yoon Lee gave a master class and talked about compromise. She was like, this woman, does she have a job? She just is in her house thinking about her 3 children all the time. Like, what does she do? And I realized I didn't know what she did. So being interested, I think, in the material reality of your characters, what they do in the morning, what they do at the end of the night. Do they have a nighttime routine? Like, these things can be, it's like these small things that really open up into the you know, they end up revealing really big aspects of these characters. But it always starts from something pretty small. Yeah.
Okay, and this will be our last question, and then after that, Ada Zhang will be happy to talk with you and sign copies of the book for you. You're welcome to have her sign one of the ones we have up here. Just pay for it on your way out. But here we go with the last question.
Thanks. I was thinking about writing as a process of dialogue with your most alert readers, or your most appreciative readers. I particularly you had the professor. I lost count of the VBADs, but to what extent do you see your writing process as a dialogue with that set of readers, and do you find it limiting? And if so, how do you obtain the benefit of dialogue with your most alert, engaged readers who are probably themselves writers? How do you limit the stultifying effects of that without becoming an intellectual hermit?
Sure. Well, I would first like to say that I do not consider myself an intellectual. I think that I have always thought that that your reader is at least as intelligent as you are. I think that's something Ethan Kanan says. So you always have to, write from that point that, you've got an intelligent reader on the other end. I guess I just really don't think about it in intellectual terms. I think about it in human terms when I'm thinking about connecting with a reader. So I do make assumptions about my reader. I assume that they're a person. I assume that they're a person who has lived, someone who's alive, and in that way, I don't think it's a matter of what degrees you have, or how much you've studied on this or that, or how much how high your education reaches. I would like to believe that anybody who's deeply engaged with the project of being a human could read these stories and get something out of them. So I think I'm more interested in connecting with people in that way rather than perhaps intellectually. Yeah.
I'll drop the adjective intellectual. Literary person.
Oh, sure. Yeah, well, I guess I just assume those literary people have beating hearts too. And I think that's, yeah, so I just think that there's someone like me in readers. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story.